Evan Carmichael once said, "Stand up for what you believe in, even if that means standing alone." John Brown planned what he hoped to be the liberation of all slaves in the South. John Brown's attempt at ending slavery was one of the biggest events leading up to the American Civil War. Today, I am going to share with you John Brown's original plan for the raid, what actually happened the night of the raid, and details from his trial. First, John Brown's original plan. The goal was to steal weapons from the Federal Army's arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and bring them to plantations and arm the slaves, hopefully leading to a slave uprising and eventually the abolition of slavery in the South. John Brown's first step was to rent a farmhouse across from the Potomac River, across from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Here, he would plan out his raid and recruit his members. John Brown originally hoped to recruit thousands of men for this raid, but only ended up recruiting 22. He recruited 16 white men, 3 of which were his sons, 3 free black men, and 3 black slaves. John Brown attempted to recruit Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but Harriet Tubman could not come because of an illness, and Frederick Douglass is quoted as saying, "You are walking into a perfect steel trap and you will not make it out alive." I got that information from pbs.org. Now for the night of the raid. Getting in to the Federal Army's arsenal in Harper's Ferry was relatively easy because the arsenal wasn't very well protected. John Brown and his men first cut the telegraph wires leading from the Federal Army's arsenal because they didn't want word to reach Washington before they had acquired the weapons they had planned to acquire. With so few members in the group, getting all of these weapons out of the arsenal proved to be quite the task, and it took a lot longer than they had first planned. This gave time for word of mouth to spread to surrounding militias, and the militias sprung into action. The militias cut off John Brown and his party's escape route, which was a bridge across the Potomac River leading back to the farmhouse. With no way out, John Brown and his men soon were stuck, and this gave time for a Marine group to spring into action, and that was led by Robert E. Lee. When the Marines arrived with Robert E. Lee, they pushed John Brown and his men into an engine house which was adjacent to the Federal Army's arsenal, and this is where a shootout occurred for about 10 hours. After the shootout had occurred, John Brown had lost 9 out of 22 men, and he sent his son out with a white flag to hopefully reach a negotiation with the Marines. When John Brown's son left the engine house, he was shot immediately and died. This lit a fire under John Brown and convinced him to keep fighting. They fought until the Marines finally decided to storm the engine house, and that's where they captured 6 of John Brown's men and John Brown. During the capturing, 5 of John Brown's men managed to escape, and they lived out lives across the United States. I got that information from civilwar.org. Now I will move on to the trial. John Brown and 6 other men were soon moved to a Virginia State Circuit Courthouse in Charleston, Virginia. They would have gone to a federal courthouse, but they wanted this trial done as soon as possible and to execute these men as soon as possible. Right out of the gates, John Brown and his men were faced with unfair prosecution. They were faced with inadequate representation due to the fact that the defense team provided for them only had 1 week to prepare for trial. So they decided to prepare nothing in this 1 week, and they went into the trial blind. John Brown and John Brown's men defense team started the trial by listing off the crimes they had committed and issuing an apology. That served as an admission of guilt, which put John Brown and his men guilty from the start. John Brown's defense team tried to save it from there, but they had no luck because every argument they made was overruled by the judge. John Brown and 6 members of his men were found guilty of treason, and they were executed within 1 month of that night in Harper's Ferry. I got that information from NEA.org. In conclusion, John Brown had good intentions, but due to poor planning and a lack of men, his intentions failed. John Brown started what could be seen as the battles leading up to the Civil War. John Brown and his men stood up for what they believed in, even though they ended up standing alone.
Yeah.